Lena Brooks had always thought early morning shifts would be the calmest part of a resort job, a quiet window, before the guests wandered out into the Florida sunshine. But today, the stillness of Palm Beach felt like it was holding its breath. She tightened her ponytail, adjusted her apron, and tried to ignore the way her temporary supervisor Sienna watched her from across the deck with an expression that hovered between annoyance and amusement. The Hale Resort was the kind of place Lena had only seen in magazines before this internship, a glittering palace of white stone glass and quiet wealth pressed against the shoreline. She moved along the poolside, carefully wiping down the lounge chairs in neat rows and humming to herself in an attempt to break the tension she always felt under Sienna's gaze. She did not notice the faint smear of water Sienna had deliberately left near the edge of the deck until her foot slid forward without warning, her body lurching as her arms flailed, and suddenly the world tilted. She plunged into the pool with a splash far louder than she intended. The shock of cold water punched a breath from her lungs, and she surfaced coughing, pushing her hair out of her face, trying to understand what had just happened. The sun had only just climbed over the roofline, and the courtyard was mostly empty except for one man standing near the far side of the pool, a tall figure whose presence seemed to shift the air. She had seen him earlier from a distance, dressed in simple dark clothes that somehow made him stand out more than any designer suit on the property. At the time, she had not known his name, just that he carried himself with the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Now he turned at the sound of her fall, his posture stiffening as he saw her struggling to get her footing. His eyebrows drew together in a sharp, worried line as he stepped quickly toward the pool. "Are you all right?" He called, his voice deep and controlled, but edged with something like alarm. Lena felt her face burn with embarrassment. She managed to grip the edge of the pool and began pulling herself out her wet uniform, weighing her down. "I'm fine," she insisted, although her voice trembled despite her best effort. "I just slipped." She expected him to look annoyed or inconvenienced because that was how every wealthy guest seemed to respond to unexpected chaos. Instead, he reached for a large towel from a nearby cart and tossed it toward her in a single fluid motion before quickly turning slightly away, giving her room to regain composure without feeling stared at. "Get dry before you get sick," he said tightly, as if forcing his voice into calm. His hands remained clenched at his sides as though he was fighting the instinct to rush closer, yet also fighting the instinct to retreat from the vulnerability of caring. Something about his tone made her freeze, not because it frightened her, but because it sounded like genuine concern, raw and unpolished, as if he had revealed a part of himself unintentionally. She wrapped the towel around her shoulders, her breath unsteady, the weight of the moment surprising her. "Thank you," she said quietly, though she was not sure he heard her. He nodded stiffly, still angled away from her as if giving her space mattered more than any display of authority. His reaction confused her. Guests rarely cared when employees stumbled, and certainly not men who looked like him. She studied him for a second, noticing the tension in his shoulders, the faint tremor in the breath he released as if the accident had shaken him more deeply than she understood. She wanted to ask if everything was all right with him, but the words stuck in her throat. Sienna approached with quick, sharp footsteps, pretending to be alarmed, though her eyes glimmered with triumph at the chaos she had caused. "What happened here?" she demanded. Lena tried to answer, but the man spoke first. "She slipped," he said steadily. "That is all. Make sure she gets a break to change into dry clothes." His tone held no room for argument. Sienna stiffened, recognizing authority even though she clearly did not know his name. "Of course, sir," she said through tight lips. Lena stared at him, stunned by the unexpected defense. Why would someone like him intervene for someone like her? He did not look at her again. Instead, he turned toward the ocean breeze, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man accustomed to control. Yet the faint trembling in his hand when he ran his fingers through his hair suggested his composure was a mask slipping at the edges. She did not know that his name was Ethan Hale, the billionaire founder of Hale Industries, or that he had arrived in Palm Beach only the night before, hoping for anonymity after months of relentless press coverage surrounding his company's merger. She did not know that he avoided crowded places because they reminded him of the reporters who once hounded his mother, or that the sight of someone unexpectedly vulnerable triggered memories he spent years burying. What she knew was simple. His reaction had been too intense, too quick, too full of something she could not name. Lena tightened the towel around her shoulders and looked down, avoiding Sienna's glare. She wanted to disappear, but she also could not ignore the strange, lingering echo of his voice. Get dry before you get sick. Concern, not command. Worry, not anger. She wondered why a man who owed her nothing would care so much. Ethan walked away swiftly as if distance might steady his thoughts, yet every step felt heavier than it should. He had not expected to react that strongly. He told himself it was because he had seen someone fall and needed help. Nothing more but the image of her struggling to climb from the water clung to him long after he disappeared through the courtyard archway. He told himself that leaving quickly was the correct choice, but even as he stepped into the shade, the question gnawed at him. Why did a stranger's fall shake him so deeply, and why could he not forget the look in her eyes when she surfaced startled and vulnerable, yet still trying to hold on to her dignity? His jaw tightened as he pushed the thought aside. He should not care at all, but he did. Far more than he should. Ethan Hale had built his entire reputation on being unshakable, a man who could walk into a boardroom lined with investors twice his age and silence them with a single measured sentence. Yet, as he sat in his temporary suite at the resort later that morning attempting to join a video conference, he found himself distracted in a way that felt dangerously unfamiliar. His assistant droned on about quarterly projections, another executive demanded clarity on supply chain projections for the upcoming product launch, but Ethan could not focus. His gaze kept drifting toward the window overlooking the courtyard, where the pool shimmered below in the humid Florida light, where only hours ago he had watched a young woman slip into the water and surface with a look of startled determination that struck him harder than he liked to admit. He tried to tell himself it was simply the shock of witnessing an accident, that any responsible person would have reacted strongly. Yet the memory would not settle quietly. It pressed against him like a persistent echo, her voice insisting she was fine, though she clearly was shaken. The way she wrapped the towel around herself without complaint. The tremor in his own voice when he told her to get dry. He rubbed his forehead, attempting to push the thought away. On screen, one of his directors asked a question that required a detailed answer, but Ethan muttered that he would send notes later and abruptly ended the call. It was unlike him to leave a meeting unfinished, but the truth was he did not trust his composure. It was infuriating how someone he did not know, someone who likely made a fraction of what his executives earned, had disrupted the carefully controlled rhythm of his mind. He stood abruptly and crossed the room, needing movement to shake off the agitation. As he stepped out of the suite and into the quieter service wing of the resort, he noticed Sienna Vale lecturing someone in a crisp, irritated tone. He slowed when he realized she was speaking to Lena, who stood with her hands clasped in front of her, still damp around the edges of her uniform, despite the change of clothes she had likely made in a hurry. "You created a safety hazard," Sienna snapped. "The deck was a mess. You know better." "It will not happen again," Lena said quietly, though her voice carried the exhaustion of someone used to taking blame even when she should not. Ethan felt something tighten in him. He knew the fall had not been Lenaya's fault. He also recognized unfair power dynamics when he saw them. Yet he forced himself not to step in. It was not his place. Employees had supervisors. He had no business involving himself, but his jaw clenched anyway. Sienna continued sharply. "One more mistake and you're off the schedule." "Understood," Lena nodded, though her eyes flickered with hurt she tried to hide. Ethan exhaled slowly. He should walk away. He should ignore it. But the idea of Lena being punished for something she did not do gnawed at him. His voice came out colder than intended when he addressed Sienna. "That will not be necessary." Both women turned, startled. Sienna straightened immediately, the authority she wielded over her staff dissolving in the presence of someone she sensed was far above her pay grade. "Sir," she said cautiously. Ethan kept his tone even. "I expect staff to be treated fairly. Accidents happen. Make sure she is reassigned away from high traffic areas for a few days. Let her recover." Sienna blinked, confused but obedient. "Of course, sir. I will adjust the schedule." She hurried away. Lena looked at Ethan with wide, uncertain eyes as if unsure whether his intervention was a kindness or a complication. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but decided against it, turning instead toward the staff hallway. Ethan watched her walk away and told himself he was simply ensuring the resort maintained reasonable working conditions. Nothing more. Yet, even he did not believe that. He returned to the courtyard seating area, trying to steady the unusual churn stirring within him. He was not used to caring about strangers, especially not employees working in environments he passed through only briefly. His world was defined by strategy, asset allocation, and managing crises from a distance. Personal involvement created risk. Emotional involvement was worse. Still, he could not shake the memory of how shaken she had looked, or how instinctively he had wanted to shield her from embarrassment. He needed to regain control. He sat down and rested his elbows on his knees, staring at the tiled ground. "She probably thinks I'm irritated with her," he muttered under his breath. He knew that was a possibility. His tone often came across harsher than he intended, especially when he tried to mask concern. Concern. The word irritated him. It did not belong in his vocabulary, and yet here it was. That afternoon, as he attempted to resume work on his laptop from a secluded cabana, Ethan noticed movement near the employee gate. Lena was pushing a cart filled with linens, her shoulders slightly hunched, as if bracing herself for another reprimand. He watched her for a moment, wondering why he felt compelled to ensure she was not being mistreated. He told himself he was only checking to make sure she had followed his instructions and taken a lighter assignment. But the truth was his gaze lingered too long. She paused, sensing eyes on her, and glanced up. Their eyes met for the briefest second, a flicker of recognition crossing her face before she looked away quickly, maneuvering the cart down a narrow hall. Something inside Ethan shifted unexpectedly at the sight. He did not understand it, and that was what unsettled him most. Later, as evening approached and the resort lights began glowing against the palm trees, he overheard two employees whispering near the bar. "Did you hear about the new temp?" one of them said. "The one who fell into the pool. Poor girl. She is on thin ice already. The supervisor cannot stand her." Ethan felt a heat rise through him, a mixture of irritation and something sharper. Gossip, rumors, judgment. He hated all of it. It was the same kind of careless chatter that once destroyed his mother, a sense of safety. He closed his laptop and stood unable to sit still. He walked toward the shoreline, letting the ocean wind hit his face. He told himself again that he should not care. Yet every attempt to distance himself only pulled him deeper into questions he did not want to answer. Why did he care at all? And why, despite every instinct telling him to focus on work and maintain emotional distance, did he find himself searching for the moment her eyes would meet his again? The sun had already slipped behind the tall palms when Lena reported for her evening shift in the secondary kitchen, a cramped but efficient space hidden behind the elegant dining halls where no guest ever ventured. She needed the extra hours because temporary contracts paid barely enough to cover rent, and though her legs ached from the long day, she pushed through the exhaustion the way she had learned to push through everything in life. Stainless steel counters gleamed beneath the fluorescent lights, pots simmered quietly, and the air carried a mix of citrus and butter from the pastry station. She stacked trays with practiced precision, trying to keep her thoughts away from the morning as embarrassing fall, or from the strange moment when the mysterious man who had helped her had also seemed unsettled himself. She did not even know his name. She only knew that his reaction had felt different from the dismissive way most people in his position might behave. She shook the thought away and reached for a set of plates when a male coworker, Jason, approached far too closely. "You working late again?" he said with a grin that did not reach his eyes. "Hard worker, huh?" His tone made Lena tense immediately. She stepped aside, creating distance. "Just finishing prep," she said firmly. Jason leaned one hand against the counter near her elbow, blocking her movement. "You know, if you want someone to put in a good word for you around here, I could help." Lenasa's stomach tightened. She had dealt with people like him before, men who assumed friendliness was an invitation. "No thanks," she replied, keeping her voice steady. "I am fine." Jason chuckled as if her refusal amused him. "Come on." "I'm just being friendly." He reached toward a tray she was holding, causing her to pull back abruptly. The sound of metal clattering drew the attention of several staff members, but none intervened. Lena lifted her chin. "I said no. Please step back." Before Jason could respond, a calm, low voice cut through the kitchen with sharp clarity. She said no. "Step away." The room went still. Lena turned, and there he was, the same man from the pool deck, standing near the doorway in a simple dark shirt that somehow made him look even more imposing under the fluorescent lights. She blinked in disbelief. What was he doing here? How long had he been watching? The shift supervisor murmured something under her breath and quickly busied herself with a stack of receipts. Jason stiffened and took 2 steps back, recognizing instinctively that this man carried authority that could end his employment with a single sentence. "Sorry, sir," Jason muttered before retreating toward the prep table. Silence lingered until Lena found her voice. "You did not have to do that," she said softly, though her heart was pounding. Ethan Hale studied her with a seriousness that made her breath hitch. "Yes, I did." His tone was softer now, but firm, with absolutely no room for argument. "No one should speak to you like that." She searched his expression but could not decipher what she saw there. It was not pity. It was not anger. It was something else, something she had no word for. She hesitated before asking the question that had hovered in her mind since that morning. "Why were you here?" His jaw shifted at the question. "I was passing through," he replied, though it was clear he had altered his route intentionally. "I wanted to make sure you were assigned lighter duties after the fall, and clearly that was necessary." Her cheeks warmed. "You really do not have to keep checking on me. I'm just staff." He shook his head once, a small, tight gesture. "You are a person who deserves respect. That is enough." The sincerity in his voice startled her. She clutched the tray closer as if grounding herself. "I should get back to work," she murmured. He nodded, but did not move immediately. Instead, he hesitated, the faintest flicker of vulnerability slipping across his features before he spoke again. "About the pool this morning," he said quietly. "I reacted strongly. Too strongly. You startled me." She blinked. "I startled you?" He let out a breath, almost a laugh, but not quite. "When someone falls unexpectedly in front of you, of course it startles you, and you looked shaken. I did not want anyone to crowd you or make things worse. That was all." Lena absorbed his words, feeling her chest loosen with a mixture of relief and confusion. The man she had mentally labeled as distant and superior was revealing cracks in that facade. She had expected him to dismiss the incident as nothing, but instead he was explaining himself with a kind of guarded honesty that pulled her in despite her hesitation. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for earlier and for now." Ethan cleared his throat as if uncomfortable with gratitude. "Get some rest after your shift," he said instead. "It has been a long day." And with that he turned to leave. But before he stepped out he paused. His hand rested briefly on the doorframe, his shoulders tightening as though fighting an inner conflict. Then he looked back at her, his eyes holding something she could not yet name. "Be careful who you trust here. Not everyone has your best intentions." The warning sent a ripple through her. She nodded slowly, unable to speak. Ethan disappeared into the hall, leaving behind the faint sense that some invisible thread had been tied between them and neither of them had intended and neither of them fully understood. She returned to her work, but her mind would not settle. His voice replayed again and again, not as a command but as something strangely protective. She wondered why someone like him carried such heaviness behind his eyes and why he had gone out of his way to intervene for her twice in one day. As the kitchen grew quieter and the night deepened, Lena realized something unsettling. For the first time since arriving at the resort, she did not feel entirely alone. And somewhere in the quiet corners of the building, a man who should not have cared at all was grappling with the same realization. The next morning arrived wrapped in a warm, early light that spilled across the resort grounds, and Lena tried to settle into her routine, even though her thoughts were anything but settled. She moved through the staff corridors carrying fresh towels toward the conference wing, determined to focus on her work and not on the man whose unexpected interventions had lodged themselves in her mind. Yet, the moment she rounded a corner, she nearly collided with him again, as if fate had decided their paths would cross no matter how carefully she tried to avoid him. Ethan Hale stood near the entrance of a private lounge finishing a brief conversation with the resort coordinator who hurried away the moment she saw Lena approaching. Ethan turned, and for a second his usually reserved expression softened as though he had been expecting her. "Morning," he said with a calm tone that held an undercurrent of something warmer. Lena froze for the briefest moment before managing a polite greeting. "Sir?" She hated how formal she sounded, but he did not seem bothered. Instead, he nodded toward the folders tucked under his arm. "I am hosting a private charity event this weekend, and apparently the resort is short-staffed. They tell me you are efficient and reliable. I would like you to assist." Lena blinked, surprised. "Me? Why, I'm just temporary staff. There are people with far more experience." His gaze did not waver. "Experience matters, but reliability matters more. You do not cut corners, you do not complain, and you do not change your behavior around people with money." That last part was delivered with a quiet intensity that made her pulse skip. "I do not hire people out of pity," he added. "I hire competence." Lena felt heat rise in her face, not embarrassment, but a strange mixture of pride and disbelief. She had spent most of her life being overlooked or underestimated. Hearing those words from someone like him unsettled her in a different way. Still, she hesitated. "I do not know if I'm the right person," she said cautiously. Guests at events like that expect perfection. He tilted his head as though considering her words carefully. Then he said, "If I did not think you were capable, I would not ask." The simplicity of it left her momentarily speechless. She was used to being told what she lacked, not what she possessed. After a long, quiet beat, she nodded. "All right, I will help." Something flickered in his eyes, almost relief, though he hid it quickly. "Good. There are details we should review before the weekend. Meet me in the East Lounge at 2. With that, he walked away with the unhurried stride of a man who rarely needed to rush, and yet something about his departure felt almost lingering, as if he were reluctant to put distance between them. When Lena arrived at the lounge later that afternoon, she found it transformed from its usual sleek, quiet space into a miniature operations hub. Folders lay open on the table, digital mock-ups of the event. Design glowed on a large screen, and Ethan stood at the center of it all, reviewing documents with the focused calm of someone who rarely made mistakes. He looked up when she entered and gestured for her to join him. "I need someone who pays attention to detail," he said without preamble. "This event matters. We are raising funds for educational technology programs in underserved communities. It is not about publicity. It is about results." His voice carried conviction, and for the first time Lena understood that his reputation for emotional distance did not come from lack of care, but from caring too much about the right things. She stepped beside him and focused on the screen. As he explained the layout, he occasionally shifted closer to demonstrate something on the floor plan, and each time the faint proximity stirred an odd flutter in her chest. It was entirely unexpected, entirely unwelcome, and entirely impossible to ignore. At one point, the sea breeze drifted through the open balcony doors, sending a gust that lifted the edge of her skirt. Instinctively, she pushed it down at the same moment Ethan stepped subtly in front of her, shielding her from the doorway without touching her. His gaze flicked to hers for just a moment, the quiet protectiveness unmistakable before he returned to the discussion as though nothing had happened. It was the kind of accidental intimacy that did not break any rules, yet left the air between them suspended in something unspoken. Later, she helped secure small wireless microphone packs onto event participants. When she reached for the pack, he was about to use her fingers brushed fabric near his collarbone by accident. The contact was fleeting, barely a whisper of touch, and yet the shift in his breath was immediate. He straightened, but did not move away. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice lower than before. She withdrew her hand quickly, trying to steady herself. This man was a contradiction, reserved yet attentive, controlled yet shaken by things he tried to hide. difficult to read, yet impossible to ignore. She finished organizing the materials and was preparing to leave when he stopped her. "There is one more thing," he said. He walked to the balcony, and she followed, drawn by curiosity. From there, she could see the ocean stretching endlessly into the horizon, shimmering beneath the late afternoon sun. "I come here to think," he said quietly, "away from boardrooms, away from cameras. This is the only place I let people see my work before it is perfect." He glanced at her as though admitting something rare. "I do not invite many people into that space." Lena felt something shift inside her, something gentle but powerful. She looked out at the water, letting the breeze lift her hair. "Thank you for trusting me," she said softly. His jaw flexed as he studied her profile. He did not respond immediately, but when he spoke, his voice always held a subtle warmth. "I trust your judgment more than you realize." They stood in silence for a moment, not awkward but easy, the kind of quiet shared by people who had stepped unknowingly into each other's orbit. Eventually, he dismissed her for the evening, but when she walked away, she sensed his gaze lingering a second longer than necessary. And somewhere behind her, Ethan Hale wondered when he had begun looking forward to seeing her again, and why the idea of not seeing her felt unexpectedly heavy. Ethan Hale had always lived inside walls no one could see, walls built from years of caution and carefully measured distance, walls that kept the world from getting close enough to wound him the way it once had. In the days following the event planning session, he found himself thinking more often about Lena Brooks than he wanted to admit, not because of the way she looked or moved or worked, but because she carried a quiet steadiness he had long forgotten existed. She approached challenges without theatrics, listened more than she spoke, and treated everyone with dignity, even when she received very little in return. It was disarming. It was unfamiliar, and it unsettled him. On a gray afternoon, he sat alone in the East Lounge reviewing the updated program list for the charity event, but his mind drifted back to memories he usually kept buried. A decade earlier, he had watched his mother unravel under the relentless attention of the media. Her private struggles turned into headlines. Her grief twisted into stories that fed the world's appetite for drama. At the time, Ethan was barely out of college, unprepared for the cruelty of cameras flashing outside their home, unprepared for the way strangers believed they had the right to every part of their lives. He had promised himself he would never allow that kind of intrusion again. He worked tirelessly to fortify boundaries, hiding vulnerability under layers of precision and silence. His wealth became armor. His influence became a shield. But the cost was isolation so thorough it became normal. No one saw the parts of him shaped by loss and fear, and he let them believe he preferred it that way. As he scrolled through event logistics, his phone vibrated with a message from Julian Ward, his longtime CFO, who rarely wasted time on small talk. "We need to discuss optics for the event," Julian wrote, "especially given the staff member you seem unusually interested in." Ethan inhaled sharply, his fingers tightening around the device. Julian had always been perceptive, but this implication was invasive and unwelcome. He ignored the message, returning instead to the window where the rain had begun to mist across the glass. Behind him, footsteps approached, and he turned, expecting a staff member, only to find Lena standing near the door holding a clipboard close to her chest. She hesitated, as if unsure whether to enter. "I was told to bring you the revised guest list," she said softly. He nodded, gesturing for her to come in. She stepped forward, handing him the clipboard, and for a moment their fingers nearly touched. Ethan felt a quiet jolt of awareness before he pulled his hand back. "Thank you," he said, keeping his voice steady. She lingered, not leaving immediately. "You seem tired," she observed, her tone cautious as though she feared overstepping. He blinked, surprised that someone had noticed. Most people never looked closely enough to see through his controlled exterior. "I have had a great deal on my mind," he admitted, offering her a restrained but honest answer. She studied him for a moment, then lowered her gaze. "If it helps," she said gently, "this event is coming together beautifully." Everyone can see how much it matters to you." Something about her sincerity hit him unexpectedly, and he felt that familiar wall inside him shift the faintest amount. He cleared his throat and set the clipboard aside. "There are things people do not understand about why I avoid attention," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Why privacy matters to me." She waited, patient, without interrupting. "My mother struggled when the press found weaknesses to exploit," he continued. "They made tragedies into stories. It changed everything about our lives. Since then, I have preferred to keep the world at a distance." For a moment, the room fell quiet except for the hum of the air conditioner. Lena lifted her eyes, meeting his with a softness that made it difficult to breathe. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "No one deserves to have their pain displayed for the world to judge." Her empathy was so straightforward and without pity that it startled him. He had expected polite discomfort, maybe a quick change of subject, but not this gentle understanding. He felt the old instinct to retreat to shut down the conversation before it opened too many doors, but something about her presence made him want to remain exactly where he was. "That is why," he said more slowly than before, "I reacted strongly when you fell in the pool." He did not need to say more. She understood immediately. "Not because of how it looked," she said, "but because you did not want anyone misinterpreting the moment." He nodded, relieved that she had pieced it together without judgment. She exhaled softly as if letting go of an invisible weight. "Thank you for explaining." He glanced at her, noticing the faint shimmer of reflection in her eyes, not tears, but depth. The kind of depth that pulled at him in ways he did not expect. "You carry yourself with a strength that is unusual," he said, surprising even himself by speaking it aloud. "Many people pretend to be confident. You simply are." Color rose gently across her cheeks, but she did not look away. "I learned early to stand alone," she replied quietly. "It is easier than expecting someone to stay." Her words were simple, yet they echoed in him more powerfully than she likely intended. He recognized that sentiment too well. Before he could stop himself, he asked, "What happened?" She hesitated, her fingers tightening on the clipboard, but instead of answering, she offered a small, steady smile that shielded her truth. "Maybe one day," she said, "but not today." He respected that boundary more than she knew. She turned to leave, but paused at the doorway as though compelled by something she could not quite name. "For what it is worth," she said, "I think that locked door you keep guarding is not as impossible to open as you think. You just never met the right person to knock." Her words lingered long after she left the room, settling into the quiet spaces he had spent years trying to keep empty. And somewhere inside him, Ethan Hale felt the faintest crack in the walls he had built, a crack shaped like hope and like fear, and like something dangerously close to longing. By the end of the week, whispers had begun circulating through the resort with the subtle force of a gathering storm, the kind of rumors that evolved with each retelling until truth and fiction blurred together. Lena felt the shift long before anyone said anything directly to her. Conversation stopped abruptly when she entered a room. Co-workers exchanged looks behind her back, and Sienna watched her with growing irritation, as if Lena had somehow trespassed into territory she had no right to approach. The more she assisted Ethan with preparations for the charity event, the more visible she became, and visibility in a place like this was rarely a gift. On Friday afternoon, as she carried floral arrangements toward the ballroom, she overheard two employees gossiping near the hallway. "I heard she has private meetings with him," one said. "The billionaire tech guy, the one who rented the entire East Wing." The other snorted. "Please. She's temporary staff. What would someone like him want with her? Unless she is trying to get his attention." Lena froze a step away, her heart sinking, even though none of the words surprised her. Resort gossip operated on the assumption that everything had a hidden agenda. Before she could slip away unseen, Sienna stepped into view, arms folded. "Lena," she said, her tone honeyed but sharp, "I need to speak with you." Reluctantly, Lena approached, bracing herself. Sienna tilted her head, studying her with an expression that pretended concern but was threaded with something far colder. "You have been given an unusual amount of access this week," she said smoothly, "and some staff are confused. To avoid misunderstandings, I suggest you stay away from certain areas until the event is over." Lena blinked. "I only go where I'm assigned." Sienna smiled thinly. "Of course, but let's not pretend you do not know how things look. People talk. Would not want anyone to assume you are seeking special treatment." Lena bit her tongue, fighting the instinct to defend herself. Sienna wanted a reaction, and Lena refused to give her one. She simply nodded and continued on her way, even as resentment tightened in her chest. She did not ask for Ethana's attention. She did not even fully understand it herself. Meanwhile, across the property, Ethan was wrapping up a call in one of the private conference rooms when Julian Ward entered without knocking. Julian always carried himself with a self-assured confidence that bordered on entitlement, a man who saw the world through calculations and leverage. He closed the door behind him and leaned against the table. "We need to talk about the staff member," Julian said without preamble. Ethan looked up sharply. "What staff member?" "Your new shadow," Julian replied coolly. "The one everyone has noticed. Lena Brooks." Ethan felt irritation simmer beneath the surface. "Her name is not your concern." Julian chuckled without humor. "Everything that affects you is my concern. Optics matter. You cannot be seen giving too much attention to an employee. It raises questions." Ethan stared at him, his patience thinning. "I am not involved with anyone." Julian lifted an eyebrow. "Yet you intervene on her behalf. You request her specifically. You spend hours with her." Ethana's jaw tightened. "She is competent. That is all. Competence does not unsettle you," Julian said softly. Ethan did not respond, but the flash in his eyes said enough. Julian exhaled as if disappointed. "Look, Ethan, your mother has experience taught us both that the world never leaves powerful men alone. If there is even a hint of impropriety, the media will tear it apart, especially right now." Ethan turned away, even the mention of his mother reopening an old wound. "This is not that. Do not make this into something it is not." Juliana's voice lowered. "I am trying to protect the company. If she becomes a problem, she needs to be removed before damage is done." Ethan spun around, sharp enough to stop Julian mid-sentence. "Do not touch her job. Do not go near her. Do I make myself clear?" Julian straightened his expression, flattening. Crystal. But the warning had already been issued. Meanwhile, in the staff lounge, Lena sat at a small table during her short break, replaying the harsh whispers she had overheard. She tried to shake them off, but each one dug deeper than the last. She worked hard, kept her head down, avoided drama. Yet somehow, she had become the center of it. She pulled out her phone to distract herself, only to see a notification from a coworker, a video. Confused, she opened it, and immediately felt her stomach plummet. It was a short clip, captured from security footage or perhaps a staff phone showing her fall into the pool earlier in the week. The angle made the moment look clumsy and foolish, as if she had staged it for attention. The caption someone added made it worse. "New girl knows how to get noticed." Lena felt her chest tighten. It was mortifying enough to have fallen, but for someone to share it and twist it into something ugly felt like a punch. She locked her phone and pressed a hand to her forehead, trying to steady her breathing. When she stepped outside to clear her head, she nearly collided with Ethan, who was striding through the hallway with focused urgency. The moment he saw her, he stopped, eyes narrowing as he took in her expression. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low and controlled but carrying a protective edge. She shook her head, not wanting to burden him, but he waited, refusing to move until she answered. "Someone posted a video," she said quietly, "making fun of me, saying I did it for attention." Ethan went very still. For a moment he said nothing, but Lena saw the change in his posture, the way his shoulders stiffened and his jaw clenched. "Show me." She hesitated, then handed him her phone. He watched the clip once, then replayed it, his expression darkening further with each second. When he finally returned the phone, his voice was a quiet growl of restrained anger. "This is unacceptable." Lena lifted her chin. "It does not matter. People will believe what they want. He stepped closer, not touching her, but standing near enough that she could feel the certainty in his presence. "It matters to me," he said. She looked up, startled by the intensity in his tone. Ethan exhaled, trying to steady himself. "I will handle it," he said, finally, each word deliberate. Lena wanted to protest, but the determination in his eyes silenced her. For the first time since the video surfaced, she felt the smallest flicker of relief. She nodded slowly. "Thank you." Ethan inclined his head once, then walked away with the quiet, controlled fury of a man who rarely let emotions surface but could no longer keep them contained. And in the shadows of the resort, a jealous world watched, misinterpreting every step, drawing conclusions that neither of them had intended. Yet bossas aus bois arror rasor sobre every seja is desalinas visayas darasana saures as since others this The evening of the charity gala arrived with an electric tension that hummed through every corner of the resort, a quiet pressure building beneath polished surfaces and flawless preparations. Twinkling lights draped across the palm trees, soft orchestral music floated through the courtyard, and guests dressed in elegant attire drifted toward the ballroom like bright, moving fragments of another world, a world Lena had only ever glimpsed from a distance. She stood near the service entrance, adjusting the simple but refined black dress the event coordinator had assigned to her, a dress that was modest yet flattering, made for staff to look polished but unobtrusive. She smoothed the fabric nervously and tried to steady her breath. It was just a shift, she told herself. Just another night of work. But when she stepped into the side hall and saw Ethan Hale standing near the ballroom doors, everything inside her faltered. He was dressed in a tailored suit that fit him with effortless precision, the deep navy fabric emphasizing the calm authority he carried even in stillness. He was speaking with a donor when he glanced up and saw her, and for a fraction of a second the world narrowed to the space between them. His expression changed almost imperceptibly, but Lena felt the shift like a pulse beneath her skin. His eyes lingered longer than they should have, his words to the donor slowing before he recovered and finished his sentence. She moved forward carefully, keeping her focus on her tasks, but her heartbeat refused to settle. Throughout the evening, she worked the floor gracefully, guiding guests toward their tables, managing last-minute adjustments, and ensuring the program unfolded smoothly. She was focused, composed, professional. Yet, every time she looked up, she felt his gaze on her as if drawn by instinct. Ethan tried to concentrate on his role as host, engaging philanthropists, answering questions about the initiative, presenting the mission with his characteristic clarity, but his attention kept drifting toward Lena. He watched her navigate the event with quiet confidence, watched her offer calm directions to volunteers, watched her steady a tray for a nervous server, watched her smile politely at guests who barely acknowledged her. And each time his chest tightened in a way that made no logical sense. It bothered him how intensely he noticed her, how easily she disrupted the rhythm he had spent years perfecting. As the auction progressed and applause filled the ballroom, Ethan stepped into a side corridor for a brief moment of quiet. He had not intended to stay long, but a familiar discomfort pulled at him, the buzz of conversations mingling with the low hum of cameras wielded by donors who enjoyed documenting their charitable presence. He leaned against the wall, closing his eyes for a second to ground himself. When he opened them, Lena was there, checking a list on a clipboard, unaware of his gaze. He watched her tuck a loose strand of hair behind her ear, a small, ordinary gesture that for some reason struck him harder than anything happening on the ballroom stage. He told himself to look away. He did not. She sensed the shift in the air before she saw him. When her head lifted, their eyes met, and something in her chest loosened and tightened at the same time. For a moment, the weight of the night disappeared, replaced by an unspoken recognition. She gave him a polite nod, intending to move past him toward the ballroom doors, but before she could, a guest bumped into her tray, causing glasses to clatter dangerously. Lena steadied them quickly, But the man who had collided with her, a middle-aged businessman with alcohol on his breath, scowled carelessly. "Watch where you're going," he snapped as though she had inconvenienced him. "I am sorry, sir," Lena began, but he waved her off dismissively. "Staff should pay attention," he muttered. Then he stepped closer, blocking her path as he glanced over her appearance with an appraising look that made her instantly uncomfortable. "You know," he drawled, lowering his voice, "maybe you could help me find the private tasting room. I am sure someone as pretty as you could show me around." Lena stiffened, gripping the tray. "I can direct you to an event coordinator, sir." His smile thinned. "I said you could show me." Before she could respond, a familiar voice sliced through the air with startling precision. "She will not be assisting you." Both turned to see Ethan standing fully upright, his expression controlled but his eyes sharp as a blade. The businessman stared in confusion until realization dawned. "Oh, Mr. Hale, I did not recognize you. I was just—" He trailed off at the cold clarity in Ethana's gaze. "Walk away," Ethan said, not loud but firm enough that the man backed up immediately, murmuring apologies before hurrying toward the ballroom. Silence followed, then Lena exhaled slowly, trying to steady her hands. "Thank you," she said quietly, though the words felt too small for the relief she felt. Ethan stepped closer, though he kept a respectful space between them. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice lower now, more human. "Yes," she managed. "Just surprised." His jaw tightened. "People like him have no right to speak to you that way." She shook her head gently. "It happens more often than you think." That made something in him flare, a mix of anger and something more protective than he wanted to admit. He inhaled to settle the feeling. "You should not have to get used to that," he said softly. Their eyes met fully then, and the moment stretched the noise of the gala dimming as if the world had stepped away to give them space. He looked at her in a way no one ever had, as if he saw not just her work or her uniform, but the person behind it. The strength and vulnerability and resilience she carried quietly. She felt her breath catch at the depth in his expression. She should look away. She did not. Instead, she found herself whispering, "You keep showing up when I least expect it." Something flickered across his face, something like truth slipping past his defenses. "I notice things," he said quietly, "and I cannot seem to unnotice you." The admission hit her heart with a force she could not explain, and for a moment neither moved. Then a volunteer called her name from down the hall, breaking the spell. She stepped back reluctantly. "I should go," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Ethan nodded, though his eyes followed her longer than he intended. "Yes, go." But even as she disappeared into the crowd, he remained exactly where he was, quietly shaken by how deeply he had been pulled toward her and how impossible it had become to look away. The gala finally wound down just before midnight, leaving behind the faint buzz of champagne conversations and the lingering glow of success reflected in the generous donations collected yet for Ethan. The night felt unfinished, as if a thread had been pulled loose somewhere in the middle of the evening, and he had been quietly unraveling ever since. He watched Lena from a distance as she guided volunteers through cleanup, her posture steady, even though exhaustion tugged visibly at her shoulders. He admired the way she never once complained, never once acted overwhelmed, even though the event had demanded far more from her than her actual role required. When the ballroom lights dimmed and the last guests drifted into chauffeured cars, he found himself stepping toward her before logic could intervene. "Lena," he called softly. She turned, startled to see him still there. Most hosts left hours ago, yet he remained standing in the quiet aftermath as though waiting for something. "You're still working," he said, approaching with measured steps. She offered a faint smile. "Just finishing up. The volunteers need direction." "They listened to you," he said, noting it with quiet certainty. She shrugged modestly. "People just want to feel valued." He absorbed that simple truth and wondered when he had forgotten it. After a moment, he cleared his throat. "There is something I want to show you, now." She hesitated, glancing at the half-folded tablecloth in her hands. Ethan spoke before she could protest. "You have worked nonstop for days. Let someone else finish. I would like to thank you properly." His tone was polite, but carried an undercurrent of something deeper, something that made her pulse stir. She nodded slowly, setting the cloth aside. "All right, lead the way." He guided her through a side corridor she had never entered before, past a locked security door that opened with his keycard, and up a short staircase that led to a rooftop terrace overlooking the ocean. The air was warm and touched with salt, and strings of low amber lights glowed softly around the perimeter, illuminating a small table set with 2 plates and covered dishes kept warm under silver lids. Lena stopped in surprise. "You did this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan looked almost apologetic. "I asked the kitchen to prepare a late meal. I thought you might be hungry. You have barely eaten all day." Her breath caught. No one in her life had ever noticed something like that. She stepped closer, taking in the scene. The gentle lighting, the quiet hum of the waves below the privacy of the rooftop far above the world that judged and whispered. It felt surreal. She sat across from him as he held the chair for her, and when their eyes met, the air settled into a quiet she felt not awkward, but safe. He removed the lids, revealing simple but comforting dishes, roasted vegetables, fresh bread, lemon chicken. Nothing extravagant, but each plate arranged with care. "I did not want anything too heavy," he said. "Thought you might be tired." She smiled softly. "This is perfect." They ate slowly, letting the silence fill naturally between them, not the silence of strangers, but the silence of 2 people trying to understand an unfamiliar connection. Lena glanced at him, studying the way the lights traced the angles of his face. "You disappear a lot during events," she said gently. "I noticed you stepped away tonight." His fork paused. "Large gatherings are difficult," he admitted. "Too many cameras. Too many people searching for weaknesses to turn into stories." She nodded, remembering what he had shared about his mother. "I noticed you looked overwhelmed," he continued quietly. "You hide it well, but I see things." The confession sent a warmth through her chest. She had spent her entire life blending into the background, yet somehow this man saw straight through the spaces she thought were invisible. "And I notice things about you too," she whispered. He looked up slowly. "Like what?" She hesitated, then said, "You are careful with people. You protect space. But sometimes it seems like you're really trying not to care too much." His breath stilled. She was not wrong. Caring had cost him before, cost him more than anyone knew. Caring meant risk. Caring meant losing control. And tonight he was dangerously close to both. He forced his voice to remain steady. "When you fell earlier this week, it reminded me of something. Not the accident itself, but the feeling of being blindsided by something you have no time to prepare for. I reacted out of worry, nothing more." She studied him openly now, sensing the layers beneath his words. "You do not need to justify wanting someone to be safe," she said softly. "That is not weakness. That is human." Ethan looked away toward the ocean where the moon reflected across the water like a wavering path. "I'm not accustomed to being seen," he murmured. Lena felt the truth in that sentence like a weight resting between them. She set down her fork lightly. "Well, you are not invisible to me." The honesty in her words sent a slow shift through him, something delicate and unsettling. He leaned back slightly, his expression loosening just enough to reveal the faintest vulnerability. "You asked earlier why I kept looking at you," he said. She swallowed, not trusting her voice. He continued, "Because I do not understand the effect you have on me. It is unfamiliar, and I do not handle unfamiliar things well." The admission was quiet but honest, and it drew them closer than any accidental touch could. She felt her breath tremble. "I do not understand it either," she confessed, "but I feel it." Between them the air tightened with something unnamed and fragile. They did not move. They did not need to. The rooftop lights flickered softly in the breeze as if marking the moment with a gentle glow. After a long, quiet beat, Ethan stood and walked toward the railing. The ocean wind lifted his hair, and he seemed momentarily younger, freer. He looked back at her, a question in his eyes, one she felt more than understood. "Will you join me?" he asked. She rose and stepped to his side, resting her hands lightly on the cool metal railing. For a moment they simply breathed the same air, listening to the waves crashing far below. It felt intimate, not because of proximity, but because of presence. Two people choosing to share silence instead of running from it. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "What happens after tonight, Ethan?" He looked at her with an expression as complex as the tide shifting below. "I do not know," he said, "but I know I do not want this to end." The words hung between them, glowing softly in the warm night air, and for the first time neither of them looked away. The morning after the rooftop dinner felt strangely unreal to Lena as she moved through her shift with a soft, lingering warmth in her chest, the kind that made everything around her seem sharper and quieter at the same time, as if the world had temporarily slowed to let her carry the memory of the night a little longer. Every detail replayed in her mind: Ethan standing beside her at the railing, the ocean wind brushing between them, the honesty in his voice, the rare vulnerability he had allowed her to see. She tried to focus on stocking supplies and confirming housekeeping schedules, but her thoughts drifted again and again to the way he had looked at her with something she could not name but felt with startling clarity. She kept telling herself it meant nothing that men like Ethan Hale did not fall into anything real with women like her, yet, no matter how many times she tried to push the thought away, her heart refused to believe it. Meanwhile, Ethan entered the morning with an intensity he could not seem to shake. His mind replaying Lena's words on the rooftop, the way she had told him he was not invisible, the way she had looked at him as though she saw more beneath his surface than anyone had dared to in years. He was not used to being affected by anyone, let alone a woman who had no reason to soften toward him, yet she did, and that terrified him more than he expected. Stepping into the private conference room inside the resort business center, Ethan found Julian Ward already waiting, tapping impatient fingers against a tablet. Julian looked up with a polite smile that faltered slightly as he studied Ethan. "Long night?" Julian asked with mock casualness. Ethan ignored the tone. "What is the agenda?" he replied. Julian slid a file across the table. "Something has come up. You should see it." Ethan opened the file, expecting financial updates, but instead found printed screenshots of online posts, blurry security clips, and a short internal memo written by one of the corporate public relations associates. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the text. Rumors regarding Mr. Hale and a resort employee continue to circulate. Video of an accidental pool fall resurfaced overnight. Several outlets are pursuing the story. Ethan felt something inside him tighten sharply. He looked up slowly. "Who resurfaced this?" Julian shrugged with feigned innocence. "Hard to say. Lena's name is trending internally. People assume she is seeking attention." Ethan slammed the file shut, startling even himself. "She is not doing that." Julian gave a well-practiced, sympathetic expression. "Public perception does not distinguish intention. The optics are bad. The board is concerned." Ethan suppressed the urge to swear. She should not be dragged into this. Julian leaned back. "Then distance yourself. Leave the resort early. Stop appearing around her. You know how these stories explode." Ethan felt cold anger settling beneath his ribs. "Someone here is feeding this." Julian lifted a shoulder. "Maybe. But the damage is already moving. If you stay near her, you will make it worse for both of you." The words were deliberate, precise, meant to exploit the one pressure point Ethan had tried to keep buried: his past. His mother's destruction by the media. The cruelty of cameras turning a person into a narrative. The memory hit him with brutal clarity, and for a moment the fear that had shaped him for years rose like a shadow behind his ribs. Julian saw it and pressed further. "Walk away from her, Ethan. It is the only smart option." Ethan did not respond. He simply closed the file, stood and walked toward the window, staring out at the resort where palm trees swayed gently in the morning breeze, unaware of the storm building above them. He hated the fear rising in him, hated how quickly the past could choke the present. But he also hated the idea of Lena being hurt worse than he hated anything else. Downstairs, Lena stepped out of a staff hallway when Sienna intercepted her with a triumphant smile, curled a little too tightly. "Seems you have made the news, sweetheart," Sienna said, tilting her phone. A freeze frame of Lena's fall from the pool camera appeared under a headline insinuating she had orchestrated it for attention. Lena felt her stomach drop. "This is ridiculous," she said, trying to breathe. Sienna lowered her voice into a mock sympathetic whisper. "People think you are climbing your way up by catching a billionaire's eye. Congratulations, you are famous now." Lena's throat tightened with humiliation. "I did nothing wrong." Sienna tapped her arm lightly. "That has never mattered in stories like this. The worst part was she was right." Lena spent the next hours dealing with guests who whispered, staff who avoided eye contact, volunteers who suddenly treated her differently. Each murmured rumor felt like a stone placed on her chest, pressing slowly until she could barely breathe. When she stepped into a storage room to catch her breath, she found herself trembling. She had never asked for any of this. She had only ever wanted to work and survive. Ethan found her moments later, alerted by a staff member who mentioned seeing her upset. "Lena," he said quietly, stepping inside. She straightened, quickly wiping her face, though no tears had fallen. "Sir, I can continue my shift. It is fine." He looked at her for one long moment, and something in his expression softened in a way that made her chest ache. "It is not fine. You should not be going through this." She shook her head. "I do not want to cause problems for you." He exhaled hard, running a hand across his jaw. "You are not the problem. The system is. People like Julian, people who twist the truth." But his voice faltered as he looked at her again, and the weight of the situation settled between them like an impossible wall. Lena stepped back slightly. "What are you saying?" Ethan forced the words out with difficulty. "If I stay here near you, the rumors will explode. The board will escalate. You will be targeted more, and I will not allow that." The words hit her like a cold wave. "So, you are leaving," she whispered. He closed his eyes briefly. "I have to. It is the only way to stop this from getting worse." The pain that crossed her face was small but devastating. "So, this is goodbye." Ethan shook his head fiercely. "No, it is not what I want, but it is what will protect you." She nodded, though her heart felt like it was cracking along a quiet fault line. "Then I will resign." He stepped forward instantly. "You should not have to do that." She lifted her chin in quiet dignity. "Maybe not, but I will not stay somewhere I am being torn apart for something I did not do." He felt the words like a blade. "Lena, please." She stepped back again, her voice soft but resolute. "It is all right, Ethan. I understand." But understanding did not make it hurt any less. Hours later, Lena left her uniform folded neatly in the locker room, placed her badge on the counter, and walked out of the resort just as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in warm pink light. Ethan watched from a distant balcony, unseen, his chest tightening with a hollow ache as he realized that though he had made the choice to protect her, he had also created the distance that tore them apart. Ethan returned to Manhattan the next morning on an early flight that felt heavier than any business trip he had taken in years, the weight of what had happened with Lena pressing against him like an ache he could neither outrun nor silence. The city greeted him with its usual restless rhythm, but for once he felt disconnected from it, moving through the familiar surroundings as if walking inside a glass shell. Hale Industries' headquarters towered above the busy streets, a symbol of control and precision. Yet, as Ethan stepped into the executive floor, he felt anything but stable. Julian was already waiting in the boardroom, surrounded by a half-circle of senior executives and corporate attorneys. The moment Ethan entered the room, the tension shifted, a silent acknowledgement of the storm gathering around them. "Sit," Julian said smoothly, gesturing toward the head seat. "We need to address an urgent discovery." Ethan kept his expression neutral, though a faint dread stirred in him. "What discovery?" Julian tapped a button on the tablet in front of him, and the large monitor at the end of the room flickered to life, displaying a series of time-stamped digital logs, internal messages, and access records. "These are server polls from the resort security system," Julian explained more to the room than to Ethan. "Someone used company access credentials to retrieve the old video of the staff accident and leak it to a private channel used by media freelancers." Ethan stared at the screen, cold fury rising in him. Who had the credentials? Julian paused as if reluctant before saying the access belongs to one of your senior-level staff. Ethan leaned forward, his voice sharp. Who? Julian turned the screen again and highlighted the name. His own. Julian Ward. A ripple passed through the room as Ethan rose slowly from his chair. That is impossible, Julian said quickly, holding up a hand. Someone must have duplicated my credentials. He attempted a forced laugh. Anyone with the right clearance could have. Ethan cut him off. Only 4 people have that level of clearance, and you are one of them. Show me the full log. Reluctantly, Julian expanded the files, revealing message chains that had been concealed within nested folders, the kind used by people who understood digital forensics well enough to hide wrongdoing, but not well enough to erase it completely. The messages showed communications between Julian and a freelance gossip broker, along with a transfer receipt linking a payment account back to a shell company Julian had created. Each line of evidence struck the room with brutal clarity. Ethan felt a controlled rage unlike any he had experienced in years. Not the explosive kind, but the kind that sharpened every nerve into resolve. Why, he asked, his voice dangerously even. Why target her? Why involve me? Julian straightened stiffly. I did not target her. I targeted the situation. You were becoming unpredictable, Ethan. Your attention was drifting. You missed 2 investor calls last quarter. The Hale Industries merger requires unwavering discipline. If you appear compromised or emotionally entangled, we lose leverage. I did what I had to do to protect the company. Ethan stared at him, stunned at the audacity, the willingness to destroy an innocent woman over a narrative. You dragged a staff worker into a media storm because you wanted control. Julian scoffed. It is a business world. Collateral damage is inevitable. She was nobody. The words hit Ethan harder than expected, igniting something fierce in his chest. Lena was not collateral. She was not a tool or a pawn. She was a person who had been humiliated and forced to walk away from her job because of Julian's manipulation. Ethan turned to the board members. This is a breach of ethics, confidentiality, and public trust. He broke company policy and weaponized private data. I want him removed immediately. Julian stiffened. You cannot fire me without a full internal investigation. Ethan lifted the printed evidence from the monitor output and placed it on the table. The investigation is concluded. Everyone in this room has seen the truth. One of the attorneys cleared her throat. Legally, we are within rights to terminate with cause and pursue damages. Julian paled, realizing his power was slipping. This is personal, Ethan. You are letting emotions lead. Ethan met his gaze steadily. For once, I am letting integrity lead. Something you forgot existed. With that, he handed the signed termination order to the HR director. Security escorted Julian out of the building while he protested loudly, but the door closed behind him with a finality that reverberated across the room. When the executives dispersed, Ethan remained standing at the end of the long glass table, the skyline reflecting behind him. For the first time in years, he felt the old fear loosening its grip, not disappearing but shifting, replaced by something clearer. He had spent too long letting the past dictate his emotional boundaries, letting the trauma of his mother's public unraveling rule every decision he made. But Lena had somehow pushed through that mental fog not by force, but by simply being someone he did not want to lose. He left the building without scheduling the afternoon meeting, something that startled his assistant, but he only said, "Clear my day." He moved quickly through the Manhattan streets, driven by a quiet urgency. Lena had walked out of the resort without expecting to hear from him again, and he realized that if he waited even one more day, the distance between them might turn into something unbridgeable. The company car pulled up to the private hangar where his jet was stored, and for the first time in months the pilots saw a different expression on his face, one not made of steel, but of determination laced with something almost fragile. "How soon can we take off?" he asked. 20 minutes, sir. Make it 10. As the engines powered up, Ethan stared out across the runway where the fading afternoon sunlight cast long shadows across the pavement. He thought of Lena's exhaustion, the hurt in her eyes, the way she had said, "I will not stay somewhere. I am being torn apart for something I did not do." He had let her walk away, but now he knew the truth, and he would not let the consequences of someone else's cruelty become her story. Not again. Not like what had happened to his mother. The jet lifted into the sky, carrying him back to Palm Beach, back to the place where she had stood in the warm evening light, with quiet dignity, despite everything tearing at her. And, for the first time in years, Ethan Hale was not running from emotion. He was running toward it. The sky over Palm Beach glowed with the warm amber light of late afternoon. When Ethan finally arrived, the sun resting low enough that the ocean shimmered like sheets of copper stretching toward the horizon, and as he stepped out of the car, the first breath he took was the deepest he had felt in days. He had come straight from the airport without stopping at the resort or the office because his mind carried only one clear direction: find Lena and make things right before the silence between them hardened into something impossible to undo. He asked a few staff members if they had seen her, and one pointed him toward the small boardwalk pier where a coastal cafe overlooked the water, a quiet place where locals worked part-time shifts outside the noise of the tourist scene. When Ethan approached the cafe, the warm scent of roasted coffee drifted toward him, and inside, behind the front counter there, she was, her hair tied loosely back, her posture tired but steadier than he expected. She was wiping a table near the window when the bell over the door chimed softly, and she looked up automatically, prepared to greet a customer, but the moment her eyes landed on him, she froze. Her breath caught in a visible ripple of surprise, and a tiny tremor passed through her hand before she set the cloth down carefully, as though she needed to anchor herself. Ethan stepped closer. Slow, deliberate, uncertain of how she might receive him, but sure of why he had come. "Lena," he said gently. She swallowed the shock lingering in her eyes, but her voice stayed calm. "You are a long way from Manhattan." He exhaled a soft, almost disbelieving laugh. "Yes, I am. And I should have come sooner." She looked down briefly, collecting herself before meeting his gaze again. "You did not owe me anything, Ethan. You said leaving was to protect me." I understood, but understanding did not erase the hurt he saw in her eyes, and it struck him with a quiet guilt that grounded his next words. "I was wrong to disappear," he said. "I thought distance would shield you from the rumors, from the pressure from people who twist the truth. But I see now that I only let you stand alone in the middle of it." She blinked, slowly processing the sincerity in his voice. "Why are you here now?" Ethan hesitated, not because he lacked an answer, but because he needed to speak it in a way that carried the truth fully. "Because everything you went through was caused by something inside my company. Julian leaked the video, orchestrated the rumors, and exploited your work for his own agenda. The boardroom, the evidence, the confrontation all replayed in his mind, but none of it mattered more than this moment. I came to tell you," he continued, "that you were never to blame for any of it." She stared at him, stunned, not by the revelation but by the conviction with which he delivered it. "I knew something was off," she whispered. "People do not turn that cruel without someone pushing." Ethan nodded. "And I should have protected you, not by walking away but by standing with you." She pressed her lips together tightly, and Ethan saw the emotional weight gather in her posture like a tide rising slow but unstoppable. "You keep thinking," she said softly, "that caring about someone is dangerous, that your feelings can ruin everything. But the truth is, you pushed me away because you were scared, not because you did not care." The words struck deeply, and he felt the truth settle in his chest, warm and painful at once. "Yes," he said quietly, "I was scared. I have lived years letting fear dictate how close I let people get. Losing control of my emotions cost my family everything once, and I have spent my entire life making sure it never happened again. But that control kept me distant from everyone, including you, when you needed someone to stand beside you." Lena stepped out from behind the counter, her movements slow, her expression cautious but open. "You did not owe me—" "Rescue," she began. He shook his head. "No, I owed you honesty. I owed you effort. And I came back because I cannot keep pretending that what I feel does not exist." She inhaled sharply, the sound barely audible over the soft roll of ocean waves outside. Ethan continued, his voice steady and vulnerable. "When I saw you hurting, I felt something inside me break. I told myself it was concern, but it was more than that. I told myself leaving was protection, but it was fear, and I am done letting fear choose for me." The cafe had emptied enough that the only sounds were distant gulls and the soft clinking of cups behind the counter. Lena looked at him long enough that he wondered if he had pushed too far, but then she stepped closer until only a breath separated them. "You hurt me," she said quietly. Not to punish him, but to acknowledge the truth. "I know," he replied just as quietly, "and I am sorry." She studied him carefully, her eyes searching not for perfection, but for sincerity. And whatever she found softened her shoulders piece by piece. "I kept telling myself you were cold," she whispered. "But you were never cold. You were terrified." He nodded, accepting her understanding with a relief almost overwhelming. She exhaled a trembling breath before adding, "And for some reason, even after everything, I still see the good in you." The admission hit him harder than he expected. Ethan reached for the rail near the window, leaning on it lightly as if grounding himself. "I do not lose control around you, Lena," he said gently. "I feel alive." The confession hung between them, glowing with a tenderness that felt both fragile and powerful. The ocean breeze swept in through the open door, carrying the scent of salt and warm sunlight. And in that quiet suspended moment something shifted between them, not forced, not dramatic, but deep. Lena looked away briefly, processing the swirl of emotion, then back at him with an expression steadier than before. "So, what happens now?" she asked softly. Ethan took a breath. "Now I stop running, and I ask if you can give me a chance to rebuild what I broke." She did not answer immediately. Instead, she stepped past him toward the pier outside, and he followed her as the sky deepened into a gentle apricot hue. They walked to the end of the wooden planks where the water shimmered beneath their feet, and she rested her hands on the railing, looking out at the horizon. "I am not asking for promises, Ethan," she said finally. "I just need to know that if we walk into your world, you will not disappear the moment things get hard." He moved to stand beside her, the distance between them shrinking with every breath. "I will not run," he said simply. "Not from you. Not anymore." She turned to him slowly, her eyes softer than the fading sunlight, and in that moment the lingering ache of everything they had endured began to loosen, replaced by something stronger than fear, something that felt dangerously close to hope. Ethan held her gaze steady, and for the first time since the day she fell into that pool, the world between them felt aligned, as if every step, every mistake, every fracture had led to this quiet, undeniable truth. "Whatever happens next," he said softly, "I am choosing it with you," and this time Lena did not look away. The next morning arrived with a calm brightness that felt almost symbolic, as if the world itself had softened around the fragile new understanding between them. And for the first time, Ethan did not wake with the familiar tightness in his chest, but with a clear, steady conviction that whatever storms waited in Manhattan, he would face them with Lena beside him, not hidden away, not pushed aside, but present in the truth of his life, his. When he invited her to fly back with him, she hesitated, not because she feared him, but because she feared the world. He came from a world of sharp headlines and sharper people, but Ethan reached for her hand, lightly offering not pressure but reassurance, and said, "I will be right beside you the entire time." That single promise steadied her more than she expected. The jet ride to New York was quiet but not uncomfortable, the kind of quiet filled with shared glances and unspoken thoughts as they watched the clouds drift beneath them. Lena looked out the window, wondering how her life had shifted so drastically in a matter of days. She had lost her job, been dragged through rumors, found herself unexpectedly protected by a man who lived in a world she had never imagined stepping into, and now she was flying toward a future that felt uncertain but strangely grounded in trust. When they landed at the private terminal, the cool New York air swept in brisk and sharp, reminding her she was far away from the warm Florida coastline. Ethan guided her through the sleek corridors of Hale Industries while employees glanced curiously in their direction, whispers already rising like faint echoes. But he ignored them all, keeping his focus on her. She walked beside him with her chin slightly lifted, refusing to shrink even though everything around her shimmered with wealth and precision. Ethan led her to a glass-walled conference floor where several senior members of his leadership team and a handful of shareholders were waiting. Their expressions varied, some curious, some skeptical, and some unmistakably judgmental. Lena felt the weight of their gazes instantly, and her stomach tightened, but she kept her posture steady, telling herself she had survived far worse. Ethan stepped forward with authoritative calm. "Thank you all for coming on short notice. Before we begin, I want to address the recent events and the false rumor that has circulated regarding myself and Miss Brooks." A wave of murmurs rippled across the room as Ethan gestured toward Lena. She remained at his side, her hands loosely clasped to hide the faint tremor she felt. One of the shareholders, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes, folded her arms. "Ethan, we understand you removed Julian Ward for misconduct, but the board still needs reassurance that this situation will not jeopardize our upcoming merger." Ethan nodded. "And you will have that reassurance. But first, you will hear the truth." Lena braced herself as one of the male shareholders spoke in a tone that attempted politeness but barely concealed skepticism. "Ms. Brooks, we appreciate you being here, but we need to understand your intentions. Did you develop a relationship with Mr. Hale for personal gain or advancement?" Lena inhaled slowly, steadying her breath. The question was insulting, but not unexpected. She lifted her gaze, meeting his eyes squarely. "No, sir. I did not pursue anything. I was simply doing my job when the rumors started. I never asked for the attention or the accusations that came with it." Another shareholder leaned forward. "And if you continue spending time with Mr. Hale, do you understand the pressure that comes with public scrutiny? Reporters will look into your life. They will rewrite your story. They will question your motives. Are you prepared for that?" Lena felt the sting behind those words. She looked around the room, and for a moment she saw exactly what they saw her as an outsider, stepping into a world that believed she did not belong. But then she thought of the rooftop dinner, the pier, the honesty Ethan had offered her, and something inside her steadied. "I cannot control what reporters say," she answered calmly. "I cannot control what people assume. But I can control my intentions. I am not here for money or advantages or status. I am here because I care about Ethan, and caring about someone should not be treated like a crime." The room fell into a brief, thoughtful silence. Ethan watched her with a flicker of admiration in his eyes as she continued. "I do not come from this world. I do not know its rules or politics, but I do know this. Ethan is a good man who carries more pressure than anyone should, and even when he tried to distance himself, it was not arrogance. It was fear, the kind that comes from doing everything alone for too long." She turned slightly toward Ethan, and her voice softened. "I do not want anything from him except honesty and the chance to figure out whatever this is without being torn apart by strangers who do not know either of us." The shareholders exchanged looks, some surprised by her composure, others reconsidering their assumptions. Ethan stepped forward, reclaiming the room with a quiet authority that silenced any lingering doubts. "I stand by her," he said evenly, "and she stands by the truth. The misconduct caused by Julian ends today, and the narrative that she manipulated her way into my life ends with it. We will not allow false speculation to influence this company." The same shareholder who had questioned Lena earlier slowly nodded. "Very well. If your personal life remains transparent and does not interfere with operations, the board will not intervene further." Ethan met her gaze firmly. "It will not interfere. It will, however, make me a better leader." Lena felt her chest warm at the sincerity in his tone. When the meeting ended, Ethan guided her out of the room and into a quieter hallway overlooking the Manhattan skyline far below. She exhaled deeply, her legs slightly weak from the tension. I did not expect that, she murmured. You handled them better than most executives I have hired, he said with a faint smile. She laughed softly, the sound fragile but growing. I was terrified. You did not look terrified. I was trying not to embarrass you. He shook his head gently. You did the opposite. You showed them what strength looks like. She met his gaze and saw relief soften the lines of his face. Thank you for standing up there with me, he said quietly. I will always stand with you, Lena replied, surprising both of them with how naturally the words came. Outside the window, the city glowed beneath them, vast, bright, untamed, and as they stood together above its endless pulse, the distance between their worlds felt smaller than it ever had. The week moved quickly after the boardroom confrontation, yet each passing day felt strangely suspended for Ethan, as though the world around him was shifting into a new orbit, one that required him to move with intention rather than instinct, and for the first time he welcomed the change instead of resisting it. The Hale Industries philanthropy event in Manhattan was scheduled for Friday, a major public unveiling of a new community tech initiative he had been shaping quietly for months. And although the press would attend in full force, Ethan felt no dread, only a steady clarity building inside him, a clarity that pointed toward one undeniable truth. He was done letting fear dictate the space between him and Lena. On the morning of the event, Lena arrived at headquarters at his invitation wearing a modest navy dress that complemented her calm presence, the kind of outfit chosen not to impress, but to feel grounded amid unfamiliar surroundings. She had no idea what the event truly was or what Ethan planned, but she trusted him enough to walk through the doors with an open mind. When he saw her step off the elevator, his breath caught in a way he did not expect, not because of her appearance, but because of the quiet steadiness she carried despite everything this world had thrown at her. You came, he said softly, approaching. I said I would, she replied, though her voice trembled slightly as she glanced at the bustling staff preparing for the live stream, cameras, cables, banners, and technicians moving with precision. Is this a big event? She asked. Ethan hesitated a moment before answering. Yes, bigger than you think. She tried to smile, but nervousness flickered in her expression. Ethan noticed and stepped closer, lowering his voice. You do not need to be afraid. Whatever happens today, I am right here. Something in his tone anchored her, and she nodded, breathing more calmly. The auditorium filled quickly with employees, partners, donors, and media representatives. The stage was framed with modest digital displays, nothing flashy but polished enough to reflect the scale of the initiative. Ethan moved backstage to speak with the lead coordinator, leaving Lena with a seat reserved in the wings. From where she stood, she could see part of the audience, the clicking of cameras already beginning the way reporters whispered predictions about upcoming announcements. She worried again whether being here might cause more rumors, but Ethan had insisted, and her trust in him had grown roots deeper than she realized. When he finally stepped onto the stage, the room quieted instantly the way it always did when he took command of a space, but today there was something softer in his posture, something more open as he looked out at the countless faces waiting for him. Thank you all for being here. Ethan began, his voice steady. Today is not only about the launch of a new initiative. It is about remembering what our work stands for. An employee beside Lena whispered, He looks different today. Less tense. More human. Lena felt her heart shift. Ethan continued speaking about community access to technology, about the responsibility companies had to support those without resources, and as he spoke, the room leaned into him, drawn by the conviction in his tone. But then he paused, and something in the air changed. There is something else I want to address, he said. Something not on the official agenda. A ripple of whispers spread quickly. Ethan glanced briefly toward the wings where Lena stood, and her breath caught. Over the past weeks, misinformation has spread involving myself and an employee, he said calmly. Rumors built on fabrication, lies created for gain. People tried to weaponize her dignity and use it to control my decisions. That ends today. Camera shutters exploded in a rapid series as reporters leaned forward, sensing the shift. Ethan continued, his voice unwavering. "I want to be clear. She did nothing wrong. She handled cruelty with grace. She was honest when many around her were not. She reminded me of what it means to see people beyond status or expectation. And because of that, because of her, I became a better leader." Lena felt tears sting her eyes, not from sadness, but from disbelief that someone like him, someone with everything to lose, would speak this truth so publicly. Ethan looked at the crowd and then directly to where she stood, unseen by most of the room. "I want to introduce someone who changed the way I move through this world." He extended his hand subtly, just enough that she knew he was calling to her. "Lena Brooks, would you join me?" A hush fell across the auditorium as she stepped forward, every eye turning toward her, but, strangely, she did not shrink. Her steps were slow but firm, carrying her across the stage where Ethan waited. When she reached him, he did not touch her, but his presence wrapped around her like a quiet shield. Cameras swiveled furiously. Reporters whispered loudly, "Is that her?" "That is the girl from the resort." Ethan stood tall beside her. "She is the person who reminded me that leadership without humanity is nothing more than control. She helped me remember something I lost along the way. Myself." Lena felt her breath tremble, but she held his gaze, finding something in his eyes that steadied her. Ethan turned slightly toward her, speaking softly but loud enough for the audience to hear. "When you fell into that pool, I thought I was witnessing an accident. But the truth is, I was witnessing the moment my life collided with someone who would change it." A soft wave of emotion moved through the room. He continued, "I made choices based on fear. I let my past dictate how close I allowed people to get. But you changed that. You made me want to choose differently." Lena swallowed hard, her vision blurring slightly from the weight of everything he was saying. Ethan took a slow breath, gathering the courage that had been building inside him for days. "So, today, in front of everyone whose opinions I once feared, I am choosing you. Not as a headline, not as a complication, but as the person who makes me want to be better." The room held its breath, waiting for her response, but the only people who existed in that moment were the two standing at the center of the stage. Lena stepped closer, the faintest smile warming her features. "Then, let us choose this together," she whispered. Applause broke out slowly at first, then stronger as people realized they were watching something genuine unfold, not a spectacle, but a truth. Ethan looked at her with a gratitude deeper than words, and together they stood under the bright lights while Manhattan shimmered beyond the glass walls, a city vast and unyielding, yet somehow suddenly full of possibility. If you are still here, reading this story, then you are exactly the kind of heart this channel was created for, someone who believes in slow-built trust, in quiet bravery, in two people choosing each other, even when the world gives them every reason to walk away. If Ethan and Lena moved you even a little, if their journey felt real or tender or familiar to something you have lived in your own life, then I hope you will take one small moment to support this channel in the simplest ways that still mean everything. Your like tells the algorithm this story mattered to someone. Your comment tells me, the writer, that the hours spent crafting every scene, every emotional beat, every moment of hesitation and hope were worth it. And your subscription builds a home here, a place where stories like this one continue to live, not because they are perfect, but because they remind us of the parts of ourselves we sometimes forget to protect. So, if you felt for Ethan, the man who spent years hiding behind control only to discover that strength is not silence but honesty, tell me in the comments. If you felt for Lena, the woman who kept showing up in the world even when it turned against her, tell me too. What moment hit you the hardest? Was it the rooftop dinner, when they finally shared the truth behind their walls? Was it the pier, where Ethan admitted he had been afraid of happiness for so long that he no longer recognized it? Or was it the final moment on the stage when he chose her, not in whispers, not in secret, but in front of everyone who once doubted her? I would love to know which scene you carried with you after the story ended. And if you are from the United States, from Florida or New York or anywhere in between, leave a comment telling me where you are watching from. If you are joining from another country, tell me that as well. One of the most beautiful parts of this channel is how many different corners of the world gather under a single story, and yet somehow all feel connected. If you want more stories like this one's with billionaire romance but grounded in real emotion with drama that pushes characters to grow, and with endings that feel earned rather than forced, then hit subscribe and turn on notifications. I promise you there are many more stories coming, stories of second chances, unexpected collisions, quiet bravery, and people discovering that love is not about perfection, but about choosing to show up even when it scares you. And finally, I want to leave you with a question, one I hope you will answer below, because your perspective might inspire the next story. Do you believe a person can truly change when they meet someone who sees them clearly for the first time? Or, put another way, has someone ever entered your life and made you feel more seen than you expected? I would love to hear your thoughts, your answers, your experiences, because this channel is not just about storytelling. It is about connection, the quiet kind, the honest kind, the kind that turns strangers into a community. Thank you for being here. Thank you for giving these stories a home. And if this one touched you even a little, do not forget to tap, like, leave a comment, and subscribe so we can keep walking through these emotional journeys together, one story at a time.